My contract was coming to end in 4 months, and I told Vince, I'm not renewing, man. I'm going home. And he was like, you're not going home. You're going to sign another deal. Vince, I'm not signing another deal, man. This is it.
Nobody in the history of WWE was quite like him. You already know the name, you already know the legend, but what you might not know is just how thin the line was. The line between the character on your screen and the real man standing behind it. Because with Mark Henry, that line did not just blur, it broke, it shattered. And when it did, the consequences were real, the damage was real, and the fear was real. This is the story of a man so powerful, so intense, and so deeply committed to his own code of respect that even the biggest wrestling company in the world could not keep him under control. These are 5 moments when Mark Henry stopped performing and started being exactly who he always was, the most physically dangerous human being in any room he walked into. When Mark snapped for real, let us start where we have to start, and with the man himself. Mark Gerald Henry was born in Silsbee, Texas, and from a very young age, it was clear that he was not like other people. He did not just lift heavy things, he set world records doing it. He squatted 953.5 pounds. He deadlifted 903.9 pounds. These were not made-up numbers. These were not exaggerations created by a marketing team. These were real, official, verified records that placed him in a category of human beings that very few people in history have ever occupied. His Olympic total of 881.8 pounds made him a record holder from 1993 through 1997. His bench press of 585 pounds was a gym record, and his snatch of 396.8 pounds was a senior U.S. record. And every single number is real. Every single number matters, because when you understand what this man was physically capable of, the 5 moments in this video stop being stories and start being warnings. His peers knew it. Big Show and Kane, 2 men who were themselves massive and powerful by any normal standard, both spoke about Henry's strength in a way that went beyond respect. They called it inhuman. They said his grip and his stability made other 300-pound men feel physically insignificant. That is not a small thing to say. That is not a throwaway compliment. When the biggest men in your industry look at one person and say that person is on a completely different level, you pay attention. And the WWE paid attention too. The problem was they did not always respond the right way. It is important to understand what the WWE actually is before you can understand why Mark Henry was such a problem for them. The company runs on a system of control. Scripts are written, matches are planned, characters are built carefully over time, and the people performing those characters are expected to operate within very specific boundaries. The system works extremely well for most people because most people in that world understand the game they are playing. They know when to be loud and when to be quiet. They know when to push and when to follow directions. They know that the character and the person are 2 different things, and they keep those 2 things separated in a way that keeps everything running smoothly. Mark Henry never fully operated that way, not because he was incapable of it, but because the separation between the character and the man was never quite as wide for him as the company needed it to be. His identity was built on something real, on legitimate physical achievement, on records that no marketing department could manufacture, on a lifetime of discipline and sacrifice in actual athletic competition. That kind of identity does not bend easily to theatrical management. And when the theatrical management pushed too hard, the real identity pushed back. Every single time. Professional wrestling has a culture. It has traditions. One of those traditions is something called a rib, a practical joke meant to test a performer and lighten the mood in the locker room. For most people in that world, ribs are part of the experience. You get pranked, you laugh, you move on. Some performers even enjoy them. When the culture of the locker room is built partly on this kind of humor, and being able to take a joke and respond well to it is considered a sign of maturity and professionalism in that world. People who cannot handle a rib are often viewed as soft or difficult to work with. The expectation is clear. You are part of a team, and the team does certain things to each other, and you accept it as part of belonging. But for Mark Henry, ribs were not funny. They were not tests of character. They were something else entirely. They were disrespect. And disrespect for a man who had spent his entire life earning everything through sheer physical discipline and force of will was not something he was willing to accept quietly. His background had given him a very specific set of values. Physical integrity mattered. Being treated as a serious person mattered. Having your space and your time respected mattered. These were not flexible principles for him. They were core to who he was, and no amount of locker room tradition or company culture was going to change that. The WWE tried. They really did try. But 5 times times in 5 very different ways, they tried to contain a man who could not be contained. And 5 times the real world broke through the scripted one. Sometimes the consequences cost money. Sometimes they cost the company its reputation. Sometimes they cost almost everything. This is where it started. It was 2011. Mark Henry had been with the WWE for 15 years. 15 years of showing up, doing the work, performing in roles that were often below what he deserved, accepting assignments that other people in his position might have refused. He had been placed in comedic storylines. He had been given mid-card roles when his physical presence alone demanded more. He had been patient in a way that very few people with his kind of power are ever patient. And then one night, during a television taping for SmackDown, that patience finally ran out. After the cameras stopped rolling for the live broadcast, Henry was told to stay in the ring. He was told that he was scheduled for a dark match, an untelevised segment performed for the live audience that stayed in the arena after the show. His opponent was supposed to be Sin Cara, the newly debuted luchador who had been generating excitement across the roster. Henry stood in the ring and waited. He waited for 1 minute. He waited for 5 minutes. And he waited for 10 minutes. The crowd sat in the arena, also waiting, also confused. Henry asked the referee, Scott Armstrong, what was happening. He was told repeatedly that Sin Cara was backstage having his knee wrapped and would be out soon. Sin Cara was never coming. That was never the plan. The entire thing was a prank, designed and approved by Vince McMahon and senior production officials. Sin Cara was not injured. He was not getting taped up. He was not even in the building anymore. The plan was simple and cruel. Leave Mark Henry stranded in that ring in front of a capacity crowd while management and the production crew quietly packed up and left the building to beat traffic. Henry stood there, alone under the lights in front of thousands of people, with nothing happening and no explanation coming. Think about what that means for a man like Mark Henry. This was not a prank about hiding something or moving a prop. This was a public humiliation. This was being made to look foolish in front of a live audience by the same company he had served for a decade and a half. Every minute he stood in that ring was another minute of his dignity being stripped away in public. Every time he asked the referee and got a vague answer, he was being lied to by people who thought this was funny. And when he finally realized what was happening, when the truth landed, something shifted inside him that was not going to shift back. He walked out of that ring and into the backstage area. He later described it as a ghost town. The crew was gone, the management was gone, the producers were gone, McMahon was gone, and the hallways that were usually filled with people were empty and quiet. And that emptiness, in some ways, made things worse. Because there was nobody to confront directly, Henry did what his body had been trained to do for his entire life. He applied force to the objects in front of him. Witnesses who were still in the building described what happened next as something close to terrifying. Henry began destroying the production infrastructure around him. He tore down lights. He punched through walls. He smashed equipment with the kind of force that left no question about what kind of man was behind it. The backstage area, which had been orderly and professional minutes earlier, was being taken apart piece by piece. One of the few people still in the building was a young writer's assistant named Ryan Ward. When Henry found him and demanded to know where McMahon was, Ward was reportedly so frightened that he was visibly shaking and could not provide a useful answer. This was not a young man being dramatic. This was a young man looking at something genuinely scary and being unable to hide it. The financial damage from that night came out to approximately $10,000 in production equipment. That is not a small number for a single outburst in a single building on a single night. But the financial cost was almost secondary to what happened next. Henry called Vince McMahon and left a voicemail. It was not a professional message. It was profanity-laced and it was direct. The message communicated one thing clearly. Mark Henry was done. He was quitting. After 15 years, he was walking away. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody expected. McMahon, after leaving the building that night to avoid the man he had just pranked, reviewed the security footage and the ring footage from the event. And what he saw in that footage was something he had not seen in years. He saw real fear. He saw real anger. He saw a man who was not performing a character, but living one. And McMahon, to his credit in this specific moment, recognized something valuable in what he was looking at. He called Henry. He apologized. He acknowledged the disrespect. And then he made a proposal. Let us make money off this. Let us take what you actually are right now in this moment and put it on television. Henry's wife played a role in convincing him to go back. His financial obligations were real, and walking away entirely was not as simple as leaving a voicemail. He returned. And what followed was one of the most significant creative transformations in the history of the company. The Hall of Pain era was born directly from that night of real destruction and real fury. Henry finally won the World Heavyweight Championship under this persona. His peers noted that something fundamental had changed in his face and in his body language. He stopped looking like a performer playing a monster and started looking like a man who genuinely did not care whether his opponents were safe. Because the line line between the character and the man had been erased, and what replaced it was something the scripted world of wrestling had always been trying to manufacture, but had never quite found. It was authenticity, raw, unmanageable, expensive authenticity, the kind that cannot be written into a script because it only exists when the script has already failed. And it was terrifying. WWE had tried to prank him into breaking. What they got instead was a performer who broke and then came back as something they had never fully seen before. They did not create the Hall of Pain. They triggered it. And there is a very big difference between those two things. But the 2011 incident was not the first time Mark Henry had lost control. It was also not the only time his anger left the building and entered the real world. In April of 2010, during a European tour, something happened that went far beyond broken equipment and angry phone calls. Something happened that involved police officers, legal consequences, and a moment where two of WWE's biggest stars had to physically hold Henry back from doing something that could not have been scripted away. The tour had brought the roster to Belfast, Northern Ireland. After a show, several wrestlers were gathered at the hotel bar at the Hilton, winding down the way people do after a long night of physical performance. A local fan named James McClay was also in the hotel and saw the wrestlers there. He approached them with a birthday card for his son and asked for autographs. By his account, most of the wrestlers were cooperative and friendly, but when he reached Mark Henry, the interaction turned ugly almost immediately. McClay described Henry as abusive and dismissive and said that the verbal exchange that followed ended with Henry throwing a drink from behind, soaking McClay, his fiancée, in and the birthday card intended for his son. Henry's own version of events, which he shared later on Busted Open Radio, framed the situation differently. In his telling, he was a man defending his personal space and his boundaries. He said directly that any man who gets a drink thrown in his face and does not respond is not someone he respects. He challenged the fan to a fight. He used aggressive language. He made it clear that he was prepared to physically engage with this person in a way that went well beyond a verbal dispute. And then he stood up. The moment Henry stood up and started moving toward McClay, two people in that room recognized what was about to happen and understood that it could not be allowed to happen. John Cena and Randy Orton, the two men who at that time carried more responsibility for representing the WWE brand than perhaps anyone else on the roster, moved to intercept. They grabbed Henry by the arms. They held him back physically. This was not a pull apart for the cameras. This was not a dramatic moment staged for a live audience. This was two professional wrestlers using their own considerable size and strength to prevent the world's strongest man from assaulting a civilian in a hotel bar in Northern Ireland, with the police likely minutes away. The effort was complicated by the presence of Chavo Guerrero, who witnesses reported was encouraging Henry rather than trying to calm him down. With Henry straining against Cena and Orton's grip, still shouting, still trying to get free, and with Guerrero adding fuel to the situation, Woody, the hotel scene was becoming something that none of the people involved were going to be able to script their way out of. The police arrived. Henry was formally arrested. The legal outcome was the issuance of an adult caution, which confirmed that the authorities viewed the incident as a legitimate breach of the peace. This was not a misunderstanding that got smoothed over quietly. This was a documented legal event involving a WWE employee at a public establishment in a foreign country. And then there is the detail about what Henry actually said publicly afterward. On Busted Open Radio, he did not apologize. He did not express regret about the confrontation or talk about how he wished things had gone differently. He said that any man who gets a drink thrown in his face and does not respond is not someone he respects. And he used specific language to make his position clear. His code of personal conduct, the code that had guided him through every confrontation in every locker room in every arena for decades, did not have an exception for public settings or professional obligations. The code was the code, and the code said that disrespect required a response. That is a very specific worldview, and it is a worldview that the WWE had no tool to change. What this moment exposed was a gap in the WWE's ability to manage Henry outside of a controlled environment. Backstage, there were walls to punch and equipment to destroy. In an arena, there were structures in place, but in a hotel bar in Belfast with a fan who had approached in what he believed was a friendly way, there was no system in place to prevent what almost happened. The only thing that prevented it was the personal intervention of Cena and Orton, acting not as characters, but as responsible people who understood the consequences of what they were watching unfold. Henry himself never fully apologized for the incident in the way the company might have preferred. His position on Busted Open Radio was one of self-defense and personal principle. This tells you something important about where his priorities were. were. He was not primarily concerned with being a good ambassador for the brand. He was primarily concerned with his own code of conduct, and that code did not bend easily to the expectations of a corporate entertainment company. WWE had sent him to Belfast as a performer and a public-facing representative. What came back was a police report and a legal caution. Then that is what happens when reality exceeds the script. Now, the third moment where WWE lost control is different from the others in one important way. It was not caused by a prank. It was not caused by a disrespectful fan. It was caused by a mistake. A simple, fixable, ordinary production mistake. And the reason it belongs in this video is because of what happened when that mistake met Mark Henry's physical reality. It was 2006. SmackDown. Mark Henry was scheduled to interfere in a steel cage match that involved Batista, MNM, and Rey Mysterio. His role was straightforward. He was going to approach the cage door, grab the chain and padlock securing it, and break it. This was a standard wrestling spot. The breaking of a chain in professional wrestling is not real breaking. Oh, it involves a gimmick link, a piece of metal that has been pre-cut or made from a softer material like lead or plastic so that it snaps the moment a wrestler pulls on it. The spot is supposed to take seconds. The chain gives way, the monster enters, the crowd reacts. On this particular night, the production crew made a mistake. They used a real chain, not a gimmick chain, not a pre-cut prop, a legitimate heavy-duty industrial steel chain secured with a standard high-security padlock. The kind of chain and padlock that you would use to secure something you genuinely did not want anyone to be able to open without bolt cutters. Henry approached the cage and grabbed the chain. He pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again. Still nothing. The cameras were rolling. Or the wrestlers inside the ring, Batista and the members of MNM, were watching Henry at the cage door, waiting for the spot to happen so they could continue the match. The segment, which should have taken a few seconds, began to stretch. 5 seconds became 10 seconds. 10 seconds became 30. 30 seconds became a minute. Witnesses who saw the unedited satellite feed described the scene as surreal. Batista and the other men in the ring were standing there with expressions that made clear they did not understand what was happening. The crowd could sense something was wrong. The broadcast team had nothing to work with, and Henry, who had come to the ring knowing exactly what was supposed to happen and when it was supposed to end, was standing outside a steel cage holding a chain that should have already been broken, wet with all of that pressure landing directly on him. This is the kind of moment that exposes the difference between a performer and an athlete. A performer in that situation improvises. They use theatrical tools to mask the problem. They gesture, they posture, they do something that keeps the audience occupied while someone behind the scenes figures out a solution. And there are many performers in wrestling history who have done exactly that, buying time with body language and stagecraft until the production catches up with the reality. Mark Henry was not that kind of performer in that moment. He was an athlete facing an obstacle and applying the problem-solving method that 15 years of powerlifting had given him. He was going to use force, real force, as much force as his body could generate until the problem was solved. Shrug and Henry, standing outside that cage with a real industrial chain in his hands and a live broadcast running behind him, made a decision. He stopped performing. He dropped the theatrical element of the spot entirely and did something that production had not asked him to do and had not planned for. He applied his actual strength. He later described what happened in the moments that followed. He said he had to heat the metal by rubbing it with his hands, trying to work the chain before applying the kind of force that his body was capable of generating. He said his fingers felt like they were going to break under the pressure he was using. He twisted. He pulled with his full body weight, using torque and raw output that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with the physical reality of being the strongest man alive. And the chain snapped, not because of a gimmick, not because of a pre-cut link, because Mark Henry's biological output exceeded the tensile strength of industrial steel. The locker room was reportedly stunned. These were people who knew Henry was strong. They had seen him in the weight room. They had heard the stories. But watching him snap a chain that would normally require bolt cutters, a chain that was not meant to break under human force, was a different kind of experience. The knowledge that this man could do this, when pushed far enough, was not abstract anymore. It was right there in front of them. Henry later noted that his hands shook for several weeks after that night. The injury was real. The effort was real. And the chain that he had just snapped was real. Production had made a mistake. And then the consequence of that mistake was a man who had no choice but to stop being a character and start being exactly what he actually was. WWE could not have scripted that moment. They did not have the tools to script it because the tools required were not theatrical. They were biological. And biology, unlike a script, does not respond to notes or revisions. Before 2011, before Belfast, before the cage chain, there was the beginning. There was the locker room of the 1990s, and there was a group of men who thought they could test a newcomer the way they tested everyone else. They were wrong. Mark Henry came to the WWE in the mid-1990s as an Olympic athlete who had not yet fully developed his professional wrestling skills. He was powerful but inexperienced in that specific world. And the locker room of that era had a culture that was significantly rougher than what most people would expect from an entertainment company. The Clique was a backstage faction of wrestlers who held enormous political power during this period and who had a particular reputation for hazing newcomers and making life difficult for people they saw as outsiders or beneath them. At some point during this early period of Henry's career, he suffered a legitimately broken ankle. For a man of his size, a broken ankle is a serious injury with serious implications for mobility and recovery. He was on crutches, physically vulnerable in a way that he would not normally allow himself to be. And the locker room chose that moment, the moment of his physical vulnerability, to prank him. Specifically, members of the locker room, with Shawn Michaels identified as the leader of the effort, hid Henry's crutches. For most people, this might read as a mean but ultimately minor prank. For Henry, it was an attack on his physical integrity while he was already compromised. It was a group of powerful men in his workplace using his injury against him as a source of entertainment. And his response was not to laugh it off or to appeal to management. His response was to deliver a warning that every person in that locker room understood was not part of a character or a story. He told them clearly, with an intensity that witnesses described as genuinely frightening, that once his cast came off and he was mobile again, he was going to deal with every person involved. He made clear that there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. The threat was direct and specific and delivered in a tone that left no room for interpretation. This was not a promo. This was a real person telling other real people that they had made a serious mistake and that consequences were coming. There was no performance in it. There was no character layered on top of it. The man in that locker room delivering that message was the same man who had spent years moving weight that most human beings could not even push off the ground. And everyone in that room understood on some level that the threat being made was not hypothetical. Shawn Michaels, during the confrontation, reportedly positioned himself behind the much larger Psycho Sid while continuing to make jokes. Henry looked at that and did not see humor. He saw cowardice dressed up as confidence, and that made things worse, not better. The situation escalated to a point where WWE management became genuinely concerned about the physical safety of their top stars, particularly Michaels. This is not a small statement. The company was worried that one of their most valuable performers might get seriously hurt by another performer, and their solution was not a disciplinary process or a formal conversation about workplace conduct. Their solution was to remove Henry from the vicinity of the people he was threatening. They sent him to Calgary, Canada, to train with the Hart family in their legendary facility known as the Dungeon. The official framing was that this was a developmental opportunity, a chance for Henry to learn from one of wrestling's most respected training lineages, and it probably was that too. But it was also functionally a cooling-off period, a way of putting physical distance between Henry and the people his very real anger was directed at until enough time had passed that the immediate threat had subsided. Henry later found out that it was actually Paul Bearer who had hidden the crutches, not the Clique members he had blamed. But the friction with Michaels was real regardless, and the exile to Canada became a defining chapter in how he understood his relationship with the company and with the locker room culture of that era. What he learned was that the WWE's formal systems could not handle him. They could not discipline him into compliance. They could not use the normal levers of authority that worked on other people. The only tool they had that actually worked was distance. They did not punish him. They moved him. And they did it because they were afraid of what would happen if they did not. That is what uncontrollable looks like from a management perspective. The fifth moment is, in some ways, the most interesting because of what it reveals about the company's relationship with Henry over time. By this point, whatever specific year it fell in, the WWE had already seen enough of Henry to know who they were dealing with. They had seen real anger. They had seen real destruction. They had seen the footage. They had paid for the equipment he smashed. They had watched senior producers stand in empty hallways, too afraid to approach him. They had seen the Belfast arrest. They had heard the voicemail he left for McMahon. And yet someone made the decision to push him again. Someone in a production truck, on the instructions of Vince McMahon himself, who chose to use the performance environment as a psychological test. The question worth asking is why? Why, after everything the company had witnessed, would anyone decide that the smart move was to test Mark Henry again using a prank? The answer probably lies in a fundamental misunderstanding about what had happened in the previous incidents. Management may have looked at the 2011 Rampage and seen a situation that had been resolved. A man who had been brought back, who had found success under the Hall of Pain character, who had won a championship and proven his value. They may have believed that the resolution meant the threat was gone, that the anger had been channeled into something productive, and the dangerous version of Henry was now safely contained within a character. They were wrong. The anger was never channeled. And it was never contained. It was simply dormant, waiting for the next moment of disrespect to wake it up again. The method this time was audio. During a dark match or a television segment, the audio technicians were instructed to loop Henry's entrance theme in a repetitive, jarring cycle, playing 3 or 4 different kinds of music in a sequence designed to be disorienting and frustrating. The goal from the company's perspective was to see whether Henry could maintain his composure and stay in character when the technical environment around him was being deliberately manipulated. Henry's psychological threshold broke almost immediately. The looping music was not a technical error he could adapt to. It was, and he understood it as, a test, another test. At another moment where management was treating him as an experiment rather than as a professional. After everything, after years of loyalty, after the physical demands of the job, after the pranks and the exile and the public incidents, they were still pushing buttons to see what would happen. What happened was that he left. He did not finish the segment. He walked out of the ring and went backstage, and then he started destroying things. The financial cost of this particular breakdown was estimated at approximately $10,000 in specialized production equipment. He smashed monitors. He ripped audio consoles and manipulated hardware. He tore cabling from its housing and physically removed it, effectively shutting down the production's ability to function for the rest of the night. The backstage area, which witnesses described as something close to a ghost town, even with some people still present, was not a place where anyone was willing to confront him. Veteran producers, people who had worked in this industry for years and had seen difficult situations before, were unwilling to put themselves in his path. He found a phone and called McMahon directly. The message was clear and direct. Henry told McMahon to take his money and do something with it that made clear he was done. This was a legitimate resignation. He meant it in that moment as completely as he had ever meant anything. The job, the character, the contract, none of it was worth being treated this way by a company that seemed to view him as a test subject rather than a professional. What brought him back was a combination of his wife's practical perspective on their financial situation and McMahon's apology the following day. McMahon called. He acknowledged what had been done. He expressed something resembling remorse, and the situation was resolved without legal consequences or formal disciplinary action. But that resolution does not change what happened. It does not change the fact that the production truck went dark. It does not change the fact that $10,000 in equipment was destroyed. It does not change the fact that veteran producers were standing in hallways unwilling to confront the man walking through them. Reality had, once again, exceeded the script. And once again, the only tool that worked was an apology from the top. When you look at all 5 of these moments together, something becomes very clear. This is not a collection of separate incidents connected only by the name of the man at the center of them. This is a pattern, and the pattern tells a story about 2 things that were never quite compatible. The world Mark Henry came from, and the world the WWE asked him to operate in. He chose his physical reality over the company's narrative needs. He chose himself. Think about what that represents. This is a man who had waited his entire career for a moment like that, who had spent 15 years in mid-card roles and comedic storylines and dark matches where nobody showed up, who had been pranked and exiled and arrested and tested until he had nothing left to prove about who he was or what he was capable of. WWE did not create Mark Henry. Not really. They put a name on him and gave him music and a storyline. But the thing that made him genuinely compelling, the thing that made the Hall of Pain era land differently than 100 other monster pushes in wrestling history, was that it was real, the anger was real, the power was real, the danger was real. And every time the company forgot that, every time they treated him like a product instead of a person, like a character instead of a man, reality broke through and reminded them of what they were actually dealing with. 5 moments. 5 times WWE tried to manage reality and failed. 5 times the scripted world ran into a man whose physical and psychological reality was simply bigger than anything the script could contain. From smashing $10,000 in production equipment to snapping industrial steel with his bare hands to requiring the personal restraint of 2 of the company's biggest stars, Mark Henry did not just break character. character. He demonstrated again and again that there was no character to break, there was only him. The WWE tried to use the tools they had. They wrote characters, they planned segments, they used pranks as tests and music as experiments and darkness matches as set pieces. All of it was theater, and theater works right up until the moment that reality shows up. When reality showed up in every one of these 5 cases, it wore the face of a man from Silsbee, Texas, who could squat 953 pounds and who had a very simple relationship with disrespect. He did not accept it, not from Vince McMahon, and not from Shawn Michaels, not from a fan in a Belfast hotel bar, not from a production truck playing music on a loop, not from an industrial chain that was not supposed to be real. Nobody and nothing got to disrespect Mark Henry without a response. That was not a character trait. That was a fact about who he was. And in the end, the most powerful thing about Mark Henry's story is not the destruction or the arrests or the confrontations. It is the fact that the WWE, one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the world, with decades of experience managing enormous personalities and complicated situations, could not figure out how to handle one man from Silsbee, Texas, who simply refused to be anything other than exactly who he was. They survived him, barely. And that is perhaps the strongest and most genuinely fitting testament to what he actually was, the world's strongest man. Not just in the gym, not just on a platform with a barbell, but in every room he ever walked into, every ring, every hotel bar, every backstage hallway at midnight. In every moment where the real world and the scripted world came into contact with each other, there was only ever one winner, and it was never the script.